Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WAFT Champagne 90.1 on your FM dial. And a Happy New Year to you. This is the January the 2nd, I think. Uh, and so, it would be first is Friday, Saturday the 2nd. This is a third, just to record. I had someone come to the door, and I thought this was fun to tell. They had been looking in the window, and we have a kind of an antique window with lots of things. And she looked at a mask, and she and her husband had stopped by, and they thought that the mask was good for their cat. Their cat likes to look at things, and if they're a little bit more dramatic, that's kind of interesting. So she wondered if she could buy the mask, and I said yes, let's do that. And she explained that the cat, when it's excited about something, gives a certain movement of its mouth parts, so they know when it's enjoying itself. So one of the other things that they have done as a couple has been to take the cat to a pet store so that the cat could move along and see. They have a fish aquarium, and the cat loves to watch the fish move. It doesn't get up and put its paw in the fish pond to capture the fish. It's just looking at it, and surprisingly, some of these animals look back, and so they took the cat along to several of these fish tanks, and sure enough, the cat indicated which would be the interesting fish. So they bought a fish for the cat, and they're also observing that the cat likes to be in charge. So they have a puppy, and sure enough, the cat is in charge. And if the cat wants to sit in a certain place, and the pup is there, then if that's going to happen, the pup removes itself. So the cat drama is interesting. I thought that was fun. Yeah. Well, it's that time of the year when you think about your places where you grew up. And one of the things I've done was to think about Hiawatha. Hiawatha was created by a guy named Wadsworth Longfellow, and he was born in 1807. But by the time it got to be 1837, he was writing poetry, and considerable amount of poetry. His father was an attorney. He went to Europe a couple of times, went to Scandinavia, and he was writing poetry with a beat to it, and he picked up a native what you would call perhaps an accent or a cadence that many native populations have, and it brings people together. It's usually well known. It might be in India a raga. It might be in Australian Aboriginals something similar, a corroboree. So this is called in Scandinavia a calavita, Kalevala, and it has a certain sort of uh, reverence in Scandinavia, Finland especially, Russia, and it differs a little bit like the Indian raga, and you can tell places by that difference. Uh, uh, so uh, my the uh, poetry uh, was rather extensive, and uh, Longfellow was thinking to write a book, a poem that was a book long. Uh, he was kind of controversial because he had uh, found out a lot about Indians. He'd been born in Maine, so he was a U.S. citizen, and uh, he was aware of Schoolcraft was an early ethno, ethnocologist who uh, recorded a lot of the history of Indian tribes at that stage were being pushed out of the East. Uh, and Longfellow took these stories and adapted them. And he wasn't looking for the hurtful side of things, which was that the white population was taking over Indian territory. He picked things that were modest and interesting, and he uh, made names that were uh, quite genuine, but perhaps a little different. Uh, and this book that he put together when he came back to the U.S. was very popular. It was around the world. And going back to my Australian background, my father had two of these books. There was Hiawatha in the Forest and Hiawatha in the Prairie, and I think there was a third. Uh, but when I came to the U.S., some of the names like the Shawnee Forest were uh, we were as brother and together reading these books. We were aware of some of the U.S. landscape and Indian tales. I went looking for one of these books when I came here, and it was hard to find them because they'd grown out of popularity because it was felt that uh, Longfellow had adapted uh, the Indian uh, tribal stories to uh, not a damaging extent, but it was not so realistic. So even in these days, that criticism is there. But the books are coming back a little because, uh, as pointed out by people, this was a drama, and drama and poetry are allowed to uh, have their liberality, and uh, even composers are getting into the act because there's here was the beloved. There's a rhythm, and it is in Africa, it's in other places, not the same rhythm, but uh, there's a pulse to it that sometimes can go with uh, African um, ways of presenting music. And so even the classical people are using that. Not that it's understood, and it does get some criticism. So it intrigued me that this relationship to my growing up was there and still is. And so I thought I would read you a little of Hiawatha. It's about making a canoe. Hiawatha was a giant. His steps were a mile long. When he had his moccasins on, he could do all sorts of things. So in this piece, Hiawatha is building a canoe, and you have to know that that's another thing that tribal people used to do in many different countries. They would find a tree that had bark that surrounded it and cut out the bark, and that would be the format of a canoe. They would go to another tree and get the structural members, and then they would go to a rosinous tree and get the rosins and eventually make a canoe and decorate it. And but in Indian style, uh, careful of the landscape and respectful of it, they would often be respectful and thank uh, the tree or the root or whatever it was for use of their resource. Uh, so Indian culture didn't exactly uh, take down the forest and use what they wanted and leave the rest. They were cautious about respecting resources, and so Hiawatha is approaching these different trees for their
bark of
um,
birch tree,
respect
of
and
your
thank you
yellow
for
bark,
your
O birch tree,
materials.
growing
So let me
by
see if I
the
can
rushing river,
read.
tall and stately in the valley. I a slight canoe will build me, build a swift chinaman for sailing. That is a native sound. That shall float upon the river like a yellow leaf in autumn, like a yellow water lily. Lay aside your cloak, O birch tree, lay aside your white skin wrapper, for the summer time is coming, and the sun is warm in heaven, and you need no white skin wrapper. That's the black. Thus aloud cried Hiawatha in the solitary forest by the rushing Tequinina, when the birds were singing gaily, in the moon of leaves were singing, and the sun from deep awakening started up and said, "Behold me, Giza, the great sun, behold me." And the tree with all its branches rustled in the breeze of morning, saying with a sigh of patience, "Take my cloak, O Hiawatha." With his knife, the tree he girdled, just beneath the lower branches, just above the room he cut it. Oh, sorry, just just above the roots he cut it, till the sap came oozing outward. Down the trunk from top to bottom, sheer he cleft the bark asunder. With a wooden wedge he raised it, stripped it from the trunk unbroken. Give me your, he's in a different tree now. Give me your boughs, O cedar, of your strong and pliant branches, my canoe to make more steady, make more strong and firm beneath me. Through the summit of the cedar went a sound, a cry of horror, went a murmur of resistance, but it whispered, bending downward, take my boughs, O Hiawatha. Down he hewed the boughs of cedar, shaped them uh, straightways to the framework, like like two bows. He formed and shaped them like two bended boughs together. Give me another tree now. Give me your roots, O tamarack, of your fibrous roots, O larch tree, my canoe to bind together, so to bind the ends together, that the water may not enter, that the river may not wet me. And the larch, with all its fibers, shivered in the air of morning, touched his forehead with his tassels, said with one long sigh of sorrow, take them all, O Hiawatha. From the earth, he tore the fibers, tore the rough roots of the large tree, closely sewed the bark together, bound it closely to the framework. Another tree. Give me your balm, O fir tree, of your balsam and your resin, so to close the seams together, that the water may not enter, that the river may not wet me. And the fir tree, tall and somber, sobbed through all its robes of darkness, rattled like a shore with pebbles, answered wailing, answered weeping, take my balm, O Hiawatha. And he took the tears and balsam, took the resin of the fir tree, smeared there with each seam and fissure, made each crevice safe from water. Another resource. Give me your quills, O hedgehog, all your quills. Okay, the hedgehog. It. I will make a necklace of them, make a girdle for my beauty, and 2 stars to deck her bosom. From a hollow in the tree, the hedgehog, with his sleepy eyes, looked at him, shot him shining quills of arrows, saying with a drowsy murmur, though the tangle of his whiskers take through the tangle of his whiskers, take my quills, O Hiawatha. From the ground the quills he gathered, all the little shining arrows, stained them in red and blue and yellow with the juice of roots and berries. Into his canoe he wrought them round its waist a single girdle, round its bows a gleaming necklace, on its breast 2 stars resplendent. Thus the birch canoe was builded in the valley by the river, in the bosom of the forest, and the forest life was in it, all its mystery and its magic, all the lightness of the birch tree, all the toughness of the cedar, all the larch's subtle sinews, and it floated on the river like a yellow leaf in autumn, like a yellow water lily. So there you have uh, sort of uh, 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 a rhythm that uh, these days can be picked up by a rapper, and uh, it's nice to learn these things. So even the name Hiawatha is it was redesigned so that it had a sound effect. Hiawatha. Uh, the previous sound was not quite so flowing. Enough of Hiawatha in the forest and the prairie. Uh, Now I want to say something about an article in the newspaper regarding rail trails. Uh, it was by Tom Kasich, who answers questions about rail trails or, or all sorts of things. But he was answering this, and it was in the newspaper and on the radio. And again, it was this morning, it was on WILL. Uh, the mayor had been standing on Broadway and looked west and thought that this could be a rail trail. And indeed, many of us were doing the same thing. We have a rail trail between Urbana and Danville, and there would be a clamor in bicycle world and hiking world to have that trail uh, connect with Champaign in a manner that would not be uh, likely to get people killed. The general traffic, especially the traffic on heavy roads, is not attuned to bicycle ways. Uh, Traffic can go past your bicycle pedal about 3 inches away, and you have to know that that's dangerous. And car doors can open, and you can fall into a trap with your bicycle. So we're not used to bicycles yet, not like Europe. In Europe, you can, some of the roads are lighted or signaled so that bicycles get to go first. Uh, It'll be a long time before we do that here. We've had some local attempts to have round intersections where you don't have to have lights, and that has fallen by the wayside. So we're looking at a different form of safety. The main safety point is where the railroad line goes across diagonally across Lincoln Avenue and University Avenue, two major traffic corridors. And so, how would you get a trail with rail? The railroad industry is paranoid about accidents. They mostly happen on main lines. We've had some serious accidents locally. One, I think, in Tolono, is where there are two lines. The car that was moving across past a parked train encountered a train that was moving on the second line. Uh,
So we know about the problem of accidents, but this is a yard which is not used very much. It's used for maintenance, storage of equipment, and possibly storage of grain if there were no outlet. So it's owned by Norfolk Southern. It has one client to the south that is Dart, and some of you might realize it because Dart has been kindly uh, taking styrofoam and making it into pellets so that it could be transported to places where it could be recycled. And Dart makes plastic cups, and there's a line that takes about 4 rail cars of plastic in the summertime, probably more than once. The equivalent of semi trailers taking that same amount of plastic would require 13 semi trailers, and uh, the road situation is much safer on the railroads. The infrastructure, once it's built, is relatively low maintenance, whereas the semi trailers very injurious of roads. They don't necessarily pay as enough taxes to have the repairs of roads and surfaces and bridges and the like. So it's cheaper to receive that plastic by rail, and it's safer and less infrastructure uh, supervision and repair. Uh, the yards has uh, provided an outlet for energy, um, an energy company providing fuel. It still has its sheds there, but it's moved its outlet to the north on the Canadian National Line that goes from southern Illinois or New Orleans actually up to Chicago. So that's a heavy duty line and probably more accessible than the Norfolk Southern site. So it's moved. Uh, you have to know that these yards are rather valuable. Uh, if with care, you can have small industry associated with the yards and the small sidings that uh, could utilize the yards. The railroads are not awfully excited about picking up a car here and a car there. Uh, the grain industry uh, wants to pick up like 25 cars here, 25 cars there, and eventually they have a grain train which is 125 or even more cars long. They're not about to go out to your small industry and pick up a few cars. Intermodal trains, which are interesting in they can be broken perhaps once every 7 units, and you can have an intermodal unit to work with. Again, not so easy because it requires a certain flow. We had a recycling yard just south in Champaign, and it had a traditional railroad access, but uh, it couldn't provide a unit car train or a portion of a unit car train. It would be they'd have a few pieces of equipment that could go out onto the main line to a manifest train. A manifest train is one that picks up all sorts of goods on the way through. But you're dealing with main lines these days that are very active, and they're taking shipping crates from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York. Uh, and although it looks like the railroads are antique when we lose railroad lines to abandonment, the main lines are active, and sometimes they're putting back second lines so that in Chicago, for instance, if you go to Chicago, often the passenger trains, which don't make a lot of money, pushed off onto a siding while the freight trains go past. It might be worth millions of dollars. Uh, so the putting back of second tracks that were removed because there was money and there was not a lot of traffic on them, it's changed, and the electronics has changed. The control of changed. The signaling, the radio contact, all changed remarkably. Well, when you look at the yards, this doesn't look like it's a place where you're going to have a lot of rail traffic, but you keep in mind that that is a possibility. So when Conrail had shown the lines, it used to be Big Four in its day, and there was a yard headquarters in Urbana, and MTD has taken over the engine yards, where steam engines and diesels too would come in to be inspected and repaired. Those yards were obsolete and have been reused. So we have some precedents for perhaps reusing the yards, but even if the yards closed out, there's a lot of real estate there that could be open space or it could be developmental space. As it is, the yards have kept 1 mile to the east. It meets up with the end of the Kickapoo Trail. And that 1 mile is used for trains to move up to that point and then be able to shunt rail cars into the yards. There was a drive to have a shortcut through the middle of that mile. It's called Smith's Road. And so the pigtail has been shortened. There's an empty part of that pigtail, which is from Smith's Road to Dobbins Drive, where there's a meeting with a half mile of unused rail trail. So going back to the mayor being interested, we have to figure out how to get into Urbana and into Champaign without killing bicyclists and hikers. The end of Main Street meets with 150 going east and west, and it's kind of an awkward bend. It's near to Aldi's, not too far from Walmart. These are specific places, but there's about half a mile from a section road outside of Walmart, and Walmart provides some parking space. So most of the people who are using the completed 7 miles of the railroad bed between
St. Joe and Urbana stop at that point. There's another half mile which goes to the Main Street junction, and Main Street is wide when it comes out of Urbana, but when it connects to the end of the Kickapoo Trail, it's very narrow and it's dangerous. And our suggestion, and a number of people are involved with this, is to reactivate that half mile between the western end of the Kickapoo Trail uh, up to Dobbins Drive to meet up with the pigtail that's not being used and get into Smith Road. That uh, enables people to duck across a few hundred yards to a trail headquarters provided by the Urbana Park District. And so trail events have been started at that point. They still have to take the East Main Street corridor, which is regarded as fairly dangerous. So the good alternative is to come through with the railroad track and then go to the north part of the yards and ask for an interim trail use. You have to know that the Kickapoo Trail is on a Rail Banking Act. The federal Congress was concerned and railroaders were concerned that they were taking out so many railroad beds that there was no connectivity. And if they wanted to replace them in years ahead, they would have to go through towns and with lots of objections and a high price. So it seemed likely that the abandoned corridors were being occupied or bought by trail people. So the federal government decided to take advantage of that, create a rail banking act which would make use of recreational trail people to preserve the dignity of railroad beds. They were especially interested in connecting railroad beds rather than little short line grain lines. Uh, so the line between Danville and Champaign could at some stage be reactivated as a rail. It's not likely, but it's there in reservation, and it was the wisdom of the federal government that if they put money into that, the development of that trail as a bicycle way, it would preserve the corridor and be interesting for an additional use, additional public use. And that was a justification because you just can't take over uh, sometimes private railroad beds and make them public. This meant that the railroad bed would be bought at a reasonable price for uh, 25 miles. Uh, but if a railroad wanted to come back in the future, uh, a legitimate railroad would be allowed to re-rail. Uh, that being said, we go back to the yards, and if the yards want to extend to Danville, they're going to have that pigtail that runs to Smith Road, and then the unused piece of the pigtail to the Forest Preserve uh, junction at Dobbins Drive. So once again, you would have to have an interim trail use agreement so that the railroad would be able to come back on that corridor if necessary. All this requires quite a bit of work to work with uh, railroad companies that may have up to 15 attorneys, engineers, railroad administrators, and the fear of accidents and the fear of invasion of railroad yards that is a working place. Uh, Lots of liability. Uh, but it's not impossible. It has precedent in other places. It also means that you have to have uh, politicians and others who will work with this situation, not beyond the imagination. Uh, and it has happened in other places. That means that in order to do it ourselves, we have to have people who are uh, willing and able to make that negotiation, and also to look to regional planning to say look to see what connectivity we have for not only humans but plants and animals. A butterfly and a bird and a bee need to be able to move around, and we are lacking those sorts of resources. They have been all used for corn and soybeans, and before that, cattle. Uh, so it's possible that we might be able to come in from Danville, Fithian, Ogden, St. Joe, and to east of Bantam, and then through the yards. And then there's another challenge. The bridge, the railroad bridge that goes across Vine Street, has an approaching embankment which is too narrow for bicycles to share. And the bridge is narrow also. Uh, so, one of the requirements of this concept would be to replace that bridge. And it might be a lighter bridge because these days steam engines were extremely heavy, and they had main drive wheels that were huge and uh, with specific weight. The modern diesel engine has several bogies, and the weight is spread, and uh, so you may be able to replace that bridge with a second-hand bridge from another abandonment, and so then again we have a railroad bridge which is built for a railroad only. So you might have to have a second bridge. There used to be a second line there, uh, so that the bridge could be adjacent to a bridge, and you'd have a separate trail for the bicycles and hikers. Having got through that, the the idea is there. It may not happen for many years, but some of you who are listening may actually be involved in solving that one problem. But then you have the ambiance of an old railroad depot that is a theater and Lille Park and a boneyard restoration and an adaptation that is interesting. And you go, uh, the trail becomes interesting and possible. And that's where the mayor was standing. And uh, the Kasich article uh, comment, she said, "Holy cow, this could work." And she was realistic in that this doesn't work quickly. It works very slowly, but it gradually gets together in pieces. But you need to know what your skeleton is, and what you're trying to save, and how it connects. Uh, so you go past the front of Carl Clinic, and believe me, hospitals enjoy these trails. one in Belleville has uh, the trail that goes past the hospital has annotations on it. It's an abandoned railroad, and a patient with a heart situation can move a certain amount, and so they have medical limitations on this, and it is used. So uh, the next step is Lincoln Avenue and University Avenue, two major roads, and a diagonal railroad bed, and it's still active. So how are you going to get across this? You could go a little north and cross the road at a less dangerous place. You could go a little south and do the same, and then come back on the other side. The opportunity for a rail with trails exists on the other side too, going right into Champaign. But knowing bicyclists, they're using their bicycle as a uh, means for getting into town from a bedroom community or just wanting to move about practically without roaming around the ridges for a bike ride, uh, they need to get across that unit. And I'm suggesting there that there be a long, long bridge starting back near the hospital and gradually going up so that it's slight enough rise for a bicycle rider to not have to get off and walk. And there's precedence for this. If you go north to O'Hare Airport, there's one of these sorts of lightweight bridges that goes across uh, expressways that are wide and duplicate. So it's possible to do. Uh, and you would come down on the other side with a similar uh, long approach. Uh, I'm thinking that that might be a valuable thing to do for a a project for bridge builders. It may be that you have to have a peg leg in the middle and the traffic goes around. It maybe have to be high enough for a crane to go through, uh, sit down, but the cranes are heavy and they only can drive on certain roads. So you have to have opportunity for them to move. And there are also ambulances and uh, other traffic that needs height. So it could be that the structure would be uh, there, and then prefabricated fences could be put onto it later. But uh, I go to railroad seminars to understand what railroaders have as far as limitations are concerned and how we work together. So now, once you get on the other side, you're still in a banner until you get to Wright Street. And the railroad could be behind Provena, which is also a, a hospital area. And uh, that corridor has already some trails on it, and it leads into uh, a Washington Street underpass, and then up to uh, an underpass that goes under Canadian National, which is a heavy duty line, and then onto uh, a abandoned Wabash line. And that Wabash line goes to another set of yards, which is abandoned, and it was big 4 yards. And Recently, that Wabash line was still used for taking out grain from the Canadian National line. But once the area was derailed recently, then the uh, Canadian National line went on to the uh, um, Norfolk Southern line, which is nearby. And the Norfolk Southern line goes through to Bloomington, and you could do the same as you're doing from Norfolk Southern in the yards through Banner, through Champaign. You can go through Mahomet to Mansfield. Not very likely because it's heavy duty grain area, and taking grain from Cargill's or Anderson's on West Champaign. And that grain goes west to a north south line. Uh, that yards could be a venue for historic trains coming in from Monticello, for a lot of different venues, a starting and a finishing place for downtown Champaign. I think we probably should stop there uh, and say thank you for the year's efforts of WEFT and Urbana Public Television to discuss these sorts of things. I'm hoping that within 30 years you might have a trail across uh, Urbana and Champaign. In Urbana, it's only a few blocks from downtown Urbana, and in Champaign, it's fairly near to Champaign too. And we need some of these alternate opportunities and places, uh, and it's part of living rather than making money. So we have to stress the opportunity to do this. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.